Every preseason, there is a large update to the game that is intended to not only evolve the game, but also make it more fresh and fun for the players. In Season 8, we had Runes Reforged, one of the biggest, if not the biggest change in the league at the time, followed by Tower Plates in Season 9, and Dragon Souls in Season 10. So Season 11 was an update of massive expectations for Riot Games, as this seemed to be the largest single patch change in League of Legends history. And it's safe to say that to an extent it did match those expectations, as literally the entire item system got reworked, which affects every single champion and every role and at every stage of the game. At the time of this video, it's been more than 6 months since preseason hits, and the community has began figuring out how the changes have affected solo queue and pro play. Riot has kind of showcased their balance direction with the new items as well. And while there is still plenty of imbalance in the game with massive power creep and blatantly overpowered and underpowered items, it's pretty much expected considering the scale of the preseason changes. So by no means am I making this video purely to criticize the current balance of the game, as this mess was expected and the extreme outliers have honestly been mostly handled at the time. The real concerns are systematic, and they're based around the design for the future of the game, rather than the community opinion on how the game sucks because it's unbalanced, or because their champion's bad, or because of the meta, or how they're struggling to adapt to the new changes quickly. That's not going to be the core of the argument in anything in this video. There are still many concerns that I had going this preseason that remain true, along with contradictions to what Riot's goals were stated to be. That said, when I say that Season 11 was a failure, I'm not suggesting that the game is ruined or it's going to crash and burn as a result of these changes. I'd say that worst case scenario, the game's in a bit of a clearly worse state than it was before, but the player base will still stay mostly committed, and the game has plenty of opportunity to grow and even flourish down the road. That's assuming that Riot makes a lot of really good decisions over the next few years, and we'll just have to wait and see what happens. But many people in the community believe that Riot really missed the mark with the item overhaul, as this was a season that was supposed to completely re-innovate League of Legends in its entirety and evolve it in a way that makes the previous seasons seem obsolete. But what we got instead were uninspired item changes across the board, with questionable design choices and incomplete item options for many champions and roles. And then on top of that, we got these arguably worse item artwork changes as well. This might sound overly critical overall, but let me explain as I dive deeper into why Season 11 was a disappointment that failed to be nearly as exciting and revolutionary as it could have been. One of the main issues is that Riot managed to make some items feel a lot less fun and interesting for seemingly no real good reason. A prime example of this is Tiamat, which in preseason 11 got split into 2 items, Tia and Mott. And I understand that the item was certainly overpowered and it definitely needed a nerf, but I disagree with the way that Riot went about splitting it up, as it just made both of these items feel worse from last season's Tiamat. Right now, for example, they could just give it 10 AD next patch for no reason at all, and the item would still feel underwhelming compared to last season. And the reason is because of the loss of the active, which provided solid burst damage during combos and additional wave clear, as you know. Tiamat not having the active simply just makes it literally just feels worse and less interesting. This active did get moved to Iron Spike Whip, but this item is so much worse as it doesn't have the Tiamat passive, it does less damage, and it has a higher cooldown, while also being about the same price as Tiamat was last season. And it's not just the Tiamat itself or the Iron Spike Whip itself that feels bad. This also translates to the Hydra items, making them feel more boring and bland without the loss of their actives. This is especially true for Titanic Hydra. It's also important to mention that both Tiamat and Iron Spike Whip have worse build paths, as they both build out of pickaxe instead of 2 longswords, making earlier recalls awkward for champions that want one of these items. Riot simply just broke an item in half to create 2 mediocre and underwhelming items. My suggestion is to make Longsword build into Iron Spike Whip, a nerfed Iron Spike Whip, which then builds into Tiamat. So yeah, you can see like the numbers right there. The numbers could be anything, honestly. I'm just kind of theory crafting here. This way you could have Gore Drinker and Stridebreaker build out of Iron Spike Whip without having the Tiamat passive attached to it. And then the Hydras can regain their actives, while Tiamat will just feel good again, despite being more expensive overall. This would cause a minor problem, and that's ranged champions building Tiamat wouldn't benefit as much from the actives, you know, if you had to compare the actives to what they were last season. But that's a minor problem in general, with potential solutions such as altering Tiamat's effects for ranged champions if Riot really wants to maintain synergy with them. If Riot is going to keep Tiamat as is, they should definitely look into reducing its cost to at least 1050 gold, and reducing its attack damage to compensate, as junglers are usually just over 100 gold short when they're full clearing in the early game, making it really hard for a lot of Tiamat junglers like Warwick, Rengar, and a few others to keep up with the early to mid game. It's also a heavy investment in lane, as it's very inefficient to just sink 1200 gold into an item and delay your mythic item. But it isn't just Tiamat that I'm upset about either, as there are multiple items that feel more simplified and uninteresting. And this includes items that don't have actives. Take a look at some of the on-hit options, such as Wit's Ends, which got stripped of its healing in place of attack damage. The item looks okay on paper, and it is, but its stats and effects are just boring. And it's a bit too similar to Bork, honestly. A little bit. It's a stretch, a little bit. Some other items also became too generic. This includes mythics such as Night Harvester, Protobelt, and Ludens, which each feel roughly the same. The effects are very close to each other and providing extra bursts and abilities along with movement speed. And the items themselves just grant AP and ability haste. While Ludens does also have mana attached to it instead of health, unlike Night Harvester or Protobelt, there really isn't a strong enough of a difference between these three items to make either of them feel super unique from each other. Another example, Sterix Gauge and Gargoyle Stoneplate are other items that accomplish roughly the same thing. Yes, one is for bruisers and one is for tanks, but both items can be built on many different champions because bruisers tend to dip into tank itemization sometimes. Both items are basically just build this for massive shields and team fights, and they are really strong together as a result because they do accomplish the same thing. But even if that is a little bit nitpicky, I'll admit it kind of is. You can stay within the bruiser itemization lane and look at Maw, which is just a worse version of Sterix that only works against magic damage, as it lost its Omnivamp and the bonus AD that the passive used to give last season, once again making another item just blander. Also, something that I found for a majority of classes, especially for bruisers, is that items in general just severely lack active options now, especially if your Mythic doesn't have an active. And it's really boring to play when all your items are just raw stats every game. Items are now even more simplistic and just provide some combination of damage, health, and for some reason movement speed nowadays. And utility options are just less exciting to buy than ever. I understand that Riot intentionally reduced the amount of active items in the game because they found that a lot of low elo players weren't using their actives. But first of all, the game shouldn't revolve around new players. And second of all they could have done is just taken a different approach to creating active items to make them less intensive to use in the middle of fights. Kind of like how Redemption, is an example of an active item that's pretty easy to use, it's fun to use, and it's effective. But if there's anything that I'm certain about with this season, it is that the entire Grievous Wounds rework was by far the worst change among them all. Riot stated that their goals for Season 11, in regards for healing, was to halt the healing power creep that has entered the game over the years, allowing for champions, mostly ones with Yuumi, to feel unkillable at some points. But instead of removing some of the unnecessary healing options, they actually just added more, in addition to providing easier access to Grievous Wounds early game, while increasing the potency of it in the late game. This change though just doesn't make any sense, as the reason healing became so annoying in the first place was the rise in easy access to healing for any champion in the game with runes like Ravenous Hunter and old items like Old Death Stance. Essentially, healing got power creeped over time, but instead of dialing back on it, they actually just added more healing items in the game in Preseason 11 while buffing Grievous Wounds to justify it. If you don't build Grievous Wounds against certain champions, you will lose the game. Anti-healing is still going to feel necessary in half of your games instead of being situational, because most champions will get healing for free. And if you're a champion that relies on healing at all, the game will feel unplayable for you if the enemy finishes their legendary item. Healing has become watered down, and it's just given to anyone now, making champions whose kits are built around it feel pretty bland at the very least and useless at most. What Riot needed to do to address healing in the game was to strip away the free healing options from most runes or items and make it feel like a rare stat again. They should have just taken away Ravenous Hunter, the healing from Death Stance, and Gunblade, rather than replace the items with other ones such as Gore Drinker, Riftmaker, and Ravenous Hydra, which provide just as much healing as before. It's okay to have some healing items, there's just a little bit too much. Especially also Ravenous Hunter is a big problem. If Riot really wanted to target champions that feel unkillable with Yuumi attached to them, they could have made 60% Grievous Wounds an active item effect that can be played around and that requires more interaction and timing to counter these combos, instead of just passively removing champions like Yuumi, Mundo, or Aatrox from the game. You might think, well, why can't they just buff the healing champions to compensate? But the point is that the change negatively affects many champions, not just one. And if Riot buffs the healing for champions like Mundo or Soraka, we've just come full circle and we're back to square one with these champions being overpowered if you don't rush Grievous Wounds against them, and useless if you do. The one benefit to come out of this anti-healing rework was that the items don't feel as painful to build anymore. I bet they still don't feel that great. But I do credit Riot actually for giving supports access to Grievous Wounds with Chemtech Putrefier, which is where I actually think that the Grievous Wounds item chain really belongs in the support role. It gives supports another option to make them feel useful without forcing carries to go off their build path and delaying their core items. But with that said, I still wish that it was something more like an active and not just a passive, you don't get to heal anymore item. It also just kind of doubles down on leaving Enchanter supports as a relatively brain dead role. Just like imagine if supports had an item with a little bit more interaction and skill expression. Something like a Redemption, but it casts like a Ring of Death that reduces healing instead of giving healing to allies. And it also slows enemies. It has some cool animation. Now, obviously, this is just kind of, I'm just throwing something out there. But the point is that the current Grievous Wounds are too basic and stat check and aren't very skill expressive or cool. Items with somewhat interesting effects like that just haven't been added recently. Which brings me to another problem with Season 11. When Redemption was added, that item truly made playing support more entertaining and fun because of how it could completely change and turn fights around, and how you could cast it while dead. Spear of Shojin was another crazy item that was also super fun to use. Yeah, it was really broken and it didn't work out in the long run, but it was no doubt interesting, and they brought it back still in the form of a more balanced item of Navoric Quick Blade because the effect was so cool to use. But my main point is that few items actually move the game forward this season and are innovative and crazy. That's exactly what I expected going into Preseason 11. But it's like when Riot designed these items, they were both too worried about the outrage of chaotic and experimental items, and they also focused too much on making the items just useful, while forgetting to also make them fun. And despite tunneling on usefulness, they didn't even really diversify the game enough to convince me that the game is in a noticeably better state in the way as items still feel limited for many champions. These items don't have the new, fresh, fun, exciting ideas that I expected coming into the preseason. Yeah, sure, if they add crazy items that push boundaries, we're going to get plenty of items that are anti-fun, broken, and cancer to play against. But this is the risk that Riot, I feel, it should be willing to take when they're going for these massive changes. I mean, that's what preseason's for. And if they're willing to experiment enough, we're going to end up with some really cool ideas that stick and take League of Legends to another level. Did they actually expect supports to enjoy building their mythics? And then outside of their mythics, their legendary items are also pretty lame themselves. For some reason, Riot decided to keep Knight's Vow in the game, despite it being, in my opinion, the least interesting item in the game for multiple seasons in a row. It just provides the hardly noticeable effect that isn't fun for the user, and it also really isn't that fun or impactful for the carry receiving the buff. At least with an item like Ardent Censer, the carry felt stronger when he got heals, unlike unlike Knight's Vow, in which you're getting tankier, but you don't really feel it enough to justify the item's existence. Zeke's, another example of an item, became extremely bland and uninspired. Frozen Heart lost its advantage and identity of being a heavy CDR tank item, and instead is only now known as one of the only items in the game that actually provides mana, which is another obvious problem with the new item system. Speaking of Frozen Heart, it's another example of an item that just somehow became more generic, with its invisible passive that, again, isn't really noticeable or satisfying for the user. It also still has the attack speed reduction aura, which is not only weak, but it's weak in a way that's annoying for the enemies, as attack speed reduction can cause people to cancel auto attacks and interrupt combos. Attack speed reduction is too frustrating of a stat, I feel, to remain in the game. I mean, there is a reason why it is rare, but I feel like if they wanted to have an effect like this on Frozen Hearts, some anti-aura effect, I feel like something like 4% damage reduction would just be as effective without causing occasional frustration for the enemy. I know this is, again, a nitpicky complaint, but it really does highlight the grand scheme of Riot's problems with deciding on how to make changes this season. Another thing that the community has been noticing is how there are multiple item combos that just synergize too well together, to the point where it actually basically reduces item diversity. A popular example is earlier on this season was Gore Drinker, Ravenous Hydra, Sterix Gauge, and Spirit Visage, which was basically built by half the bridges in the game at the time. Not just because the other item choices were bad, although that was part of it, but because these items were just way too good together. So Spirit Visage is probably like the biggest offender here, as by itself it's pretty bad and not very useful outside of this combo. But with all the shielding and healing that you got from this combo, it became a massive power spike. And now that some of the items have been nerfed down, you only realistically see much play from Sterix and Gore Drinker overall. Another example, Moonstone and Staff of Flowing Water. You see those two items built together all the time, and if you build one, you're probably going to build the other. And I really wouldn't mind item synergies like this if there were actual options to choose from, whereas right now it's just, yeah, if you get item A, you have to go to item B. You can't choose C, D, or E. That's basically my gripe here. Since this video is getting a little bit long, I'll try to speedrun the last few issues that there are with the new items, since their issues are just pretty self-explanatory. So first of all, gold costs are inflated, which is really annoying as items are just so expensive now across the board. Everything just is like 200 to 400 gold more expensive, it seems, this season. And it's fine that there are expensive options, it's just there should be cheaper options as well, like there was in previous seasons. Also, magic resist was not fixed. That was one of the biggest issues last season, was that MR options were pretty bad, not very diverse, and limited. And they somehow seem to just make that worse this season, which is actually impressive. The MR options did get buffed recently, so they're pretty good right now. It's just the fact that lack of options is what I guess is what I'm talking about. And the problem's not fixed. They can buff the MR options, make them good, but it's still not really like a good set of MR items in general. There's the movement speed power creep, or the mobility power creep in general, with items like Gale Force, Stride Breaker, Dead Man's Plate, Force of Nature, you know, the Hecarim Udyr meta that we just had in the jungle for about 8 years. Yeah, that was fun. It kind of breaks the rules of the game. Champions that were balanced around being immobile are not immobile anymore. And if you don't build movement speed, everything else is going to outrun you, because everything gets movement speed nowadays, it seems. And there's also the fact that the only role that feels better this season is basically ADC. You might think that like Assassins are in a pretty good spot at the moment, but their builds are just basically the same every game, as a bunch of their options are pretty bad. And once some items get nerfed down for Assassins, the holes in their itemization will really start to show. And then there's the jungle issues this season, just feeling worse in general, with the removal of Machete, making AoE power farm junglers reign supreme. Now here, I think that the solution's pretty clear. Just nerf the burn damage on the jungle item and bring back the on-hit effect that it had in the preseason, so the auto attack based champions can clear faster, while also nerfing the supreme speed of champions like Udyr, Hecarim, Morgana, Lilia, etc. I think the recent jungle changes was overall a benefit to the jungle with leveling the playing field, but I honestly don't know why they don't just bring back the on hits to make everything balanced. I know I commented this on Reddit before, and people completely were like, oh, there's a couple attack-based champions that are meta, but there's only a couple champions that are like decent, that are good in the jungle, that are auto attack based. And like 90% of them are AoE. So it's just, I'd rather just, you know, make this change and only have to nerf a couple champions than leave it as is and have to nerf like 10 champions basically, or buff 10 champions. Mythics were also implemented poorly. The fact that Mythics don't really stand out how they should just means that the item options are really just restricted across the board, which actually kind of goes against the entire purpose of them to begin with. While sometimes there is technically some variation you can have with Mythic items, most are just too bland and close in feel with each other for them to be interesting. You know, see like my argument earlier with Protobell, Night Harvester, Luden's Echo. And I'm really just confused as to what Riot's intentions were with Mythics in general. I feel that Mythics should be probably just nerfed across the board in their base stats, and then also buffed in their Mythic passives to make the items feel better later on and not as attractive early on. This way that you can actually build the best item for the laning phase and then buy the best Mythic for the mid to late game, say as like a third or fourth item. Like as a tank, it's really weird to rush an item that gives you magic resist when you are laning against an AD champion. And similarly, it's also really weird to build something like Turbo Chem Tank first, as anyone that isn't a jungler when it's just clearly not a great active for laning, despite it being really good for engaging team fights. And on the other hand, items like Trinity Force and Divine Sunder are clear rush items that you can't really wait to buy on most champions. So not only does being forced to rush a Mythic limit the amount of items that you can realistically get early on, but it encourages you to build the item effects that benefit you most in lane, rather than the effects that benefit you most for team fights. It seems like Riot changed what they wanted the identity of these items to be midway through making them. Are they supposed to be rush items, or are they supposed to be playstyle defining items that you build later on in the game? Personally, I think it makes the most sense to make them scaling, playstyle defining items to open up item diversity in the early game and emphasize the decision making on choosing between the active and passive effects that you want from your Mythic item. And for the last topic that I want to touch on in this video, like I mentioned earlier, the item artwork was a big miss this season. And it's not because the artwork is actually like bad. It's definitely good art. It's just the fact that the items don't stand out or differentiate themselves from each other. Everything looks basically the same. There's no clear, crisp lines or vibrant colors that the previous items had to make them stand out, and we're missing that, and it's minor. It's a minor problem. Usually the art team's pretty fire, but I think the direction was a big miss this season. And then I didn't want to touch on stuff like mage itemization lacking AP or anything like that this season, because I think that's something that can be solved over the course of like a couple of patches, simply by buffing the AP or by shifting the stats a little bit. I just think that's kind of more of a simple problem, like an actual balance issue, as opposed to, you know, systematic. And I think the issues in this video are a little bit more complicated, I should say. So to basically summarize the main issues with this season, the new item system just lacks a clear direction, and the items are either too watered down and generic, and some of them fail to stand out from the others and have a clear identity. So let me know in the comments what your thoughts are with Season 11, and if you agree or disagree with some of the points that I made here. Of course, a lot of the opinions I stated are objective and can be viewed from various angles. Also, the purpose of this video isn't just to rip on Riot or anything like that, but it's to express my issues with the huge changes to the game, because I know Riot is capable of approaching it better, and I also hope that they'll address some of the issues sooner rather than later. Anyways, hope you guys enjoyed the video, and good luck with this season.